John 20, verses 24 and 31. Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my fingers where the nails were, and put my hands into his side, I will not believe it." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may have believed that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Good morning. How are you all?
Good.
Okay. That was a very muted response. How are you all? So we haven't even gotten to the sermon yet. You guys are already tired. Would you all pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you for gathering us here today in communion and celebration with each other. Thank you for bringing us together to hear your word, to learn from it, to meditate on it, and through it to become better disciples for you in this world. Help us and bless us in whatever we do, wherever we go, so that we might be lights to this earth for you. And now, Lord, may the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So my whole family's here today. My mom, my dad, and my sister are all here. My mom is up there with my girlfriend as like my biggest fan, but she's also like my biggest critic. So if she walks out in the middle of my sermon in frustration, like you'll know I've done my job right. No, but seriously, I don't write sermons to be controversial. So forgive me. But anyways, I think Thomas gets a bad rep. I'm serious. Those who were with me in Bible study this week know just how serious I am. He's a good guy. Seems to be getting along with the disciples. Hasn't really caused any trouble. And now it seems he's getting absolutely crapped on. On top of that, we've even given him a nickname, Doubting Thomas. I mean, apart from being somewhat presumptuous of us, you have to admit, it's kind of rude. Just to catch up on the story so far, Thomas is mentioned by speech 3 times in the Gospel of John, including this. First, Thomas tells the disciples that they should follow Jesus, even if it means dying with him. Then, Thomas asks a reasonable question of Jesus when Jesus is talking about preparing a heavenly place for his followers. Thomas wonders how they will know the way if they don't know where Jesus is going. It's a reasonable question. Basically, what we have when we arrive at this point in the story is a disciple who at once was ready to die for doing the ever-rebellious act of following Jesus, and at another point wanted to clarify how they would know the way to Jesus' heavenly home so that they could join him. Both instances are instances where Thomas showed probably more faith than the other disciples. In essence, he's a good disciple. He wants to know the way. He asks questions that cross all of our minds, and he's ready to die for the person he claims is Lord. So yeah, I think Thomas gets a bad rep. On the other hand, Thomas's bad rep makes him the disciple we most easily relate to. Most sermons I've heard preached on Thomas circle around the same idea, that he validates our doubts, that in him we find comfort, that at least one of the disciples wanted evidence, proof of the resurrected God. Further, Thomas actually gets the evidence he wants. Jesus shows up, offers him his body, the same broken body that Thomas says he needs to touch in order to believe. Thomas gives doubters like us hope that we can encounter Christ as well, that Christ will offer himself as the physical evidence our modern minds need in order to rationalize the resurrection. Except Thomas is only doing exactly as the other disciples did. He, just as the disciples did to Mary Magdalene, rejects the verbal witness of the resurrection. The triumphant, "We have seen the Lord." It doesn't do it for him. If you remember, just a couple verses earlier, the disciples didn't rejoice at the news of the resurrection until Jesus appeared to them himself. Until Jesus showed up and showed them his body and his scars, the other disciples didn't rejoice. They didn't call him Lord. All of this is to say, Thomas gets a bad rep. He's just doing what the other disciples were. Now, as much as we might want to relate to Thomas, and as much as we might want to find in him the validation of our doubts, the story of Thomas isn't so much about doubt versus faith, reason versus the supernatural, or any binaries we might want to draw. The story of Thomas is one of surprise. Surprise that shatters the binaries we want to impose on it. I mean, look at verse 25. Thomas sets out the very conditions of his belief, of his having faith. He lays out the material prerequisites necessary for him to acknowledge Jesus' true resurrection. He gives us the very framework he thinks he needs in order to believe. And I quote, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Not only does Thomas need to see the marks, he insists that he has to touch them as well. That he has to lay his hands on Jesus to confirm that he's not an illusion or a ghost or a spirit. Thomas is firm in his conviction that unless he can experience the physical reality of the resurrected Christ, he will not believe. In other words, Thomas refuses to believe just as the other 11 refused to believe before him. But here's the catch. The other disciples, they didn't set out conditions for their belief. They simply didn't believe Mary until they saw Jesus for themselves. Thomas sets out conditions, and Jesus, to no one's surprise, meets them. He shows up for Thomas. He gives Thomas the very thing Thomas says he thinks he needs for faith. He gives Thomas his body. He offers himself up just as he offered himself up on Good Friday several days earlier. And in case you didn't notice when the scripture was being read, pay attention now, because this next bit is important. I'm talking to you, Pastor Carey, it's time to wake up. Thomas doesn't touch Jesus. Thomas doesn't touch Jesus. Thomas doesn't do what we think he's going to do. In fact, for all intents and purposes, he doesn't do what he thinks he's going to do. He doesn't do what he's supposed to do in this moment. The climax we all expect, the climax we all want, the climax we see depicted in so many pieces of art, it doesn't happen. John, the evangelist, gives us no indication that Thomas even raises a finger towards the risen Lord. Without hesitation, at the moment of Jesus' offering, a light bulb goes off in Thomas's head. And he, for the first time in the Gospel of John, correctly, fully, and finally names Jesus as both Lord and God. As the theologian Rudolf Bultmann noted, this confession acknowledges that Jesus' return to the Father is now complete, that Jesus shares in God's glory. The words that started the Gospel of John ring true in Thomas's double confession. The word, capital W, that was in the beginning with God, the word, capital W, that was God, is fully revealed in and through Thomas's confession. Further, his pronouncement is itself the climax and surprise of the Gospel of John. It's the recognition that Jesus is not only the person in whom we place our faith, but he is the mediator of our faith as well. He makes possible faith. He makes possible our faith that in all other circumstances, with all other preconditions, wouldn't be possible at all. He's not only the subject of our faith, but the content as well. What happens in the encounter between Jesus and Thomas is Thomas's recognition that Jesus will not only always be present to us, but that his presence and offering is precisely what allows us to see that he is indeed the risen Christ. It is the offering of Christ, the offering Christ makes of himself, of his body, that opens up the door for Thomas's faith. It's not the laying of hands. It's rather Jesus' presence. I feel like most Christians are familiar with the question, how can you believe? Or in its more piercing and articulate form, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know that Christ is the Savior of the world? How do you know God exists? How do you know any of it's true? It's one of the hardest hitting questions for a lot of us. We don't know how to answer it. And for most of us, the most appropriate response seems always to be, well, I have faith. But in all of my encounters with people asking these questions, people outside the faith and in all my interactions, never have I felt that I have faith was a satisfactory answer. Never have I felt that that was the full picture. Don't get me wrong, I'm not bashing faith here. Don't get me wrong, it's not that I don't have faith. Don't get me wrong, it's not that there is anything inherently wrong with that answer. It's something a little deeper than that. The question's wrong. The question we're so often asked isn't the right question at all. It's misplaced. Which explains in part my feeling that my answer isn't satisfactory. There's nothing wrong with the answer, it just doesn't match the question. And it doesn't match the question because the question doesn't match the gospel. Because as the encounter between Jesus and Thomas shows us, our faith isn't about knowledge. We have no stake in the game of knowing. If we did, Thomas would have touched Jesus' hands, his feet, and his side, feeling the physical truth of the resurrection. And you can be sure that John wouldn't have left any stories out. He would have given us all the evidence we needed, all the evidence that he had. But we don't. We don't get that. It's why John feels okay leaving things out. Listen to verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book. He leaves out what we modern people would consider good evidence and replaces it with what he knows to be enough. John gives us enough. Enough to believe like Thomas. Enough to understand that faith isn't about knowledge, but is about trust in the risen Word. Enough to, as verse 31 tells us, believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing we may have life in his name. The reason I've never felt like I've given a complete answer is because an answer like, I have faith, isn't complete. John's message to us in verses 30 and 31 is clear. John leaves stuff out because he wants us to realize what it means to have faith, or rather, to partake in it. John leaves stuff out because the offering of Christ to Thomas and to us is not only all we need for faith, but is the very ground in which the seeds of our faith are planted. What Thomas teaches us, and what we would all be better off in recognizing, is that the contents of our faith is not knowledge. To say, I have faith, is not to say that I believe in a series of supernatural, seemingly impossible events that happened 2,000 years ago, although that's not necessarily wrong. I mean, it's no coincidence that one of the last stories John tells, and the last story he tells before announcing the purpose of his book, is a story in which Jesus offers to Thomas what Thomas thinks he needs for his faith, only for Thomas to realize that it is Jesus himself who allows Thomas to engage in the very faith he seeks. It is Jesus' offering of himself that clarifies for Thomas what was clouded all along. The contents of our faith. What we mean when we say, I have faith, is not knowledge, but trust. Trust that the resurrected Lord Jesus Christ is our God, and that he offers himself to us freely and graciously. Trust that in his death and resurrection, our plights, our sufferings, our difference, our pain, our guilt, our very sinful nature was washed away by his blood. Trust that the very offering given to Thomas is the same offering open to us. Trust that the truth of the gospel is present to each of us just as it was present to the disciples. And this trust is open to each of us, always and everywhere. So the next time you're asked the question, how do you know? You'll know what to say. So go. Go into the world announcing the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. And do so with the courage of knowing that Jesus has made it possible for you to believe like Thomas. I offer to you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. My mom's still here, so I obviously didn't do enough. I don't know why you're clapping.
If you could stay up here as we sing this song, Come to the Altar, and